The death toll in the Gaza Strip in the past few days has now risen to over 5,700. Many of those are children. Aid trucks are being allowed in through the Rafah border post with Egypt, but it's at a pace still far too slow to meet the needs of the hundreds of thousands of displaced Gazans. While 4 Israeli hostages have now been released, there are some 200 that are still being held by Hamas after their attack on Israel on October the 7th, which left over 1,400 people dead. The horrific attack on Israel and the relentless attack on Gaza in return has sent shockwaves across the world, dividing people on an already highly emotional and polarized issue. And of course, it's raised fears that this could lead to a broader regional conflict. Let's speak now to Elizabeth Sidiropoulus, Director of the SA Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us. How at risk do you think we are of this war between Israel and Gaza, or Israel and Hamas, broadening? Would you say that that's still a very real risk?
Absolutely, yes, Sally. It's still a very real risk. We've seen the escalation already over the last 2 weeks. This is not a simple conflict in the sense that, as we know, the Middle East, Israel-Palestine issue has been brewing for many years, for many decades. And this is simply the latest iteration of it. You have multiple actors that you're having to deal with, both within Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, externally in the region. When you have so many actors, you have so many variables, and something can go wrong in terms of the escalation. So that's very real. Doesn't mean it has happened, but it does mean that certainly over the last few days, the trajectory would indicate that things are heating up. They're not sort of calming down, notwithstanding the fact that some hostages have been released, that some convoys, humanitarian convoys, are making their way into Gaza, but as you said, not enough.
Yeah, it's interesting that Emmanuel Macron of France is there today. He's been meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, but he's also speaking to the Palestinian Authority's Mahmoud Abbas, and I think he's the first leader to be doing that. Of course, we know that when Joe Biden of the US arrived last week, it was just after that disputed hospital attack in Gaza, and then all the appointments that he was meant to have with other leaders were cancelled. He only met Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you think that they will be appealing for cool heads, and could they help mediate? Particularly bearing in mind that I'm just going to paraphrase what Antonio Guterres of the UN has said, and I'm quoting here: it's important to recognize the attacks by Hamas didn't happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing. But the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas. And those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. I mean, it's exactly what you said about how very convoluted, intertwined, and there's horror and heartbreak all round. But making the point that not enough has been done to deal with this problem of occupation. Do you think that this could ultimately, when everyone is thinking in a more rational, less emotional way, do you think that this could lead to international players getting involved and finding a solution? So
it's true to say that any crisis can create a positive opportunity for change, in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a sustainable peace. A sustainable peace clearly is one that takes into account all the UN Security Council resolutions and speaks to what the various peace accords that celebrated 30 years, the Oslo peace accords, and then the subsequent also Arab initiatives and so on, spoke about a two-state solution. What has been the case is that over the last couple of decades, that process of really moving towards a two-state solution has stagnated. What we have seen, unfortunately, has been the erosion of the middle ground, where you can actually build some compromise on both sides. And so you've had the ones who are driving the Palestinian struggle is Hamas. It's not the Palestinian Authority. We've even seen in the West Bank the emergence of militias who are taking up arms, who are also causing the Israelis to act against them, because there is a sense that this process is going nowhere, that the occupation is getting harsher, and so on and so forth. And on the Israeli side, you've also had a hardening of position. So the middle ground that is so necessary to be able to move forward on a solution which will require both sides to compromise is not there. The question is, does this conflict now create the opportunity for external actors to really put pressure on both sides to move forward? And of course, the big challenge with Hamas is that Hamas doesn't recognize Israel. So the challenges around negotiating with Hamas, well, it's not a challenge, it's non-existent. I mean, Israel won't negotiate with Hamas. But what Israel can do is provide, set out a process that can actually strengthen its counterpart among Palestinians that is more moderate and so on. But I don't know in Israel at this point whether that climate is there, but it might emerge, because we also have to bear in mind that the Israeli economy is also being affected. You know, they've deployed over 360,000 reservists. I mean, these are people who, you know, in their ordinary life have jobs and so on. So there is that economic dimension, and I do believe that external actors who have leverage with either the Israelis or Hamas or Palestinian Authority and other regional players really need to use that leverage in a coordinated fashion to try to, in the first instance, de-escalate, bring about a ceasefire, and then try to reconstitute some sort of process, confidence-building measures that can lead in the medium term, because I don't think it's going to happen now, to a situation where we can perhaps look towards the possibility of a sustainable peace and a two-state solution.
If we look closer to home, you know, South Africa, of course, we're lauded because we avoided even more bloodshed and transitioned to a democracy without a civil war and without protracted years of war, I suppose. Some say that was necessitated on the part of the nationalist government by a realization that the economy would eventually fall apart because of sanctions. Possibly there was some moral sense that the right thing had to be done at last. So that's one example of a transition. The other, of course, is Northern Ireland. It seems so intractable. Some say that was made possible because eventually both sides were just so tired of the bloodshed and the fighting. Do you think there are any lessons from both Northern Ireland and South Africa that perhaps could be taken on board for the Middle East? Or is it a unique case and perhaps a more difficult case than either of those two scenarios?
I think there are probably lessons. Obviously, each case is unique. You know, both South Africa and Northern Ireland and Israel, Palestine have their own particular contexts and histories. But one of the first and important lessons, certainly from the South African experience, and I'm much more able to talk about the South African experience than the Northern Ireland experience. It's not one that I have deep expertise in, but certainly is that, you know, it's important to have two partners that can bring their constituencies to the negotiating table. If one partner is so weak that can't happen, and for example, and I'm going to open a parenthesis here in the context of the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, I think over the last couple of years, and more recently, is really in effect seen by many in the West Bank as being the subcontract of Israel. So, you know, any attempt of the Palestinian Authority now to be the driver of a process of negotiations probably isn't going to have the legitimacy that is necessary for that outcome to be sustainable and to be durable and to be enforceable. So the first lesson from the South African context is you need both sides or all sides to actually to be able to bring their supporters to the table. That's the most important one. Of course, one of the differences with Israel is that in the South African case, we were creating a state, a united state, a rainbow nation, flawed as that might be. In the Israeli case, Israel-Palestine, we're talking about creating two separate states. And that has its own complications in it. mean, the first thing is, critically, in the South African case, of course, the global environment was changing, and I think that also acted as an important driver. Here, the global environment is changing, but I would argue it's changing towards greater polarization than what we saw in the 1990s in the world. And I think that might act as a negative factor in bringing parties together, unless, of course, the major powers, because we also have to recognize the role that major powers can play in this, the major powers can work together to exert influence so that we can move in a particular direction. And it requires a significant mindset shift. The developments in the West Bank over the last several years have created a really fragmented West Bank Palestinian Authority. Of course, Gaza has been barricaded. It's been walled off. So there are very unique circumstances, but I think there are lessons that we can learn about the process that can help perhaps to bring us to a situation of de-escalation and possible negotiations.
Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. Yes, and of course we are seeing growing calls for a ceasefire. Let's hope that call is ultimately heeded. Elizabeth Sidiropoulus, thank you so much, Director of the SA Institute of International Affairs.